And verse 37, they were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented. And then I've always liked this expression right here, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in the mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. He's talking here about Old Testament prophets, Old Testament proclaimers of the Word, and he's talking about all of the sacrifices they endured. And then he says, of whom the world was not worthy. That is, they were so good and so righteous and so sacrificial, the world did not really deserve them or their influence. And I think about some of the men that have blazed the trail for us in years gone by. I like this building, and I find that a lot of our brethren now have very commodious, attractive buildings. And we don't need it quite as much now as we have a few weeks ago, but you notice this building is air conditioned. And I drove down here yesterday from Tennessee, and I had an air conditioned car. When I was growing up, we did not have an air conditioned car. We rolled the windows down. That was about the only air conditioning I knew as a child in an automobile. But now and then we have air-conditioned automobiles, air-conditioned, commodious, attractive buildings, and we enjoy so many things that we did not have in years gone by. Even during my lifetime, some things have changed. Twice, I might not tell this, I may have some of you worried, but twice I have fainted in the pulpit. I mean, in a gospel meeting when I was up preaching, I have just fallen out. But in both of those cases, it was in an un-air-conditioned building in the month of July. And I was up preaching, and they said I didn't have a dry thread. I perspired, and my clothes were damp, and I just keeled over during the meeting. By the way, they came up, had a cloth, they dipped it in some cool water, and they bathed my face a little bit, and I got up and finished the lesson. The only air conditioning we had back in those days, and incidentally, I have saved one or two of our air conditioners from my early days. I saved them as remembrances of what it was like. It's a piece of cardboard on a stick. And it had the name usually of the local funeral home. And you sat in the meeting of the church and you used that to fan yourself and to work up a little bit of a breeze. That was the only air conditioning we had. Then later I can remember holding some meetings where that there were oscillating fans that were either in the windows or on a little platform that had been built for them, and those fans would go back and forth and stir up a little air in the building. So we've come a long way, and I look back and I think about some of the brethren that have gone before and about what they suffered, what they endured in order for us to enjoy some of the things that we do today. And I'm going to refer to a thing or two. I have a book here. I think it's out of print now. I don't know whether it's ever been brought back or not. If you ever have a chance to get it, I highly recommend it. It's called Arkansas Angels. And it's written by Brother Boyd Morgan. And Brother Morgan wrote this book about the old-time preachers in the state of Arkansas. And I've read this book several times just because I love reading about these older preachers and all they went through and the sacrifices that they made in years gone by. And I'm going to refer to one or two of them in our lesson this morning. He tells in here especially about a preacher over in northeastern Arkansas or north central Arkansas. The preacher's name was Joe Blue. And Brother Blue was a very famous preacher in his day. He held many meetings. He held a number of debates. He lived in the same community his whole life. He farmed. You know, many preachers back in the day did not preach full time. They could not have afforded it. They could not have lived on what churches paid them. And so they had some other occupation. Some of them were teachers. Some of them, like Brother Blue, were farmers. And he worked out in the fields and raised a crop, earned a living in that way, lived in the same community his entire life, and then went around and conducted meetings, conducted debates, preached the truth. I want to tell you a little about Brother Blue. In this book, Arkansas Angels, Brother Boyd Morgan expresses the great admiration that he had for Joe Blue. And here is one of the stories that Brother Blue told. Somebody asked Brother Blue to write down some biographical information about himself. And I'm reading from what he wrote down at that time. He says, Brother O.L. Hayes and I. Now, this man's name was Oscar L. Hayes. And the reason I know that, years ago when I preached in Memphis, Brother Hayes' daughter was a member of the church where I preached. So I never knew him, but I knew his daughter, and I knew something about his story. And Brother Blue says, Brother O.L. Hayes and I were called to Cotter, Arkansas to hold a meeting in 1904 in the month of January. And they paid us $2 and a handkerchief apiece. Now you think about that. These men went and preached the gospel in this community, and when the meeting was over, they gave them $2, and they gave each of them a handkerchief. That's what they got. When the meeting closed, remember this was January in Arkansas. When the meeting closed, there was a 3-inch snow on the ground. And we walked home a distance of 46 miles. I have gotten off the train at Hardy, Arkansas in the night and taken my suitcase and walked home that night a distance of 25 miles. Now, this is what some of our old preachers did in order to preach the gospel. They'd go somewhere, hold a meeting. They would not receive enough compensation even to pay for their train ticket back home. And they traveled largely by train back in that day. So they would sometimes ride the train to the meeting, not have enough money to buy a ticket home, and when the brethren paid them for their services, they still would not have enough money to get home. And so he says here, he has ridden the train before to Hardy, Arkansas, which would have been a little south of where he lived, 25 miles, and then walked 25 miles from the train station in order to get home. And he and Brother Hayes held this one meeting in January with a 3-inch snow on the ground, and they did not have enough money at the end of the meeting to get home by train, and they walked through 3 inches of snow for 46 miles in order to get home. You know, when I read things like that, my heart just swells with admiration. I think about men like Brother Blue, Brother Hayes, men that were preachers of the gospel, men that loved the church, and they loved the truth, and they went, as it were, everywhere preaching the word, and they did so at great personal sacrifice to themselves. Well, there's another thing or two here about Brother Blue that I want to tell you. And here's one of them. I'm reading again from Brother Morgan's book. He says, there has not been a sectarian sermon preached in the neighborhood where Brother Blue lived in 35 years. Now that takes a little explanation, so let me tell you what he's talking about. Brother Blue was very much admired in his home community. As I said, he was a farmer, he was a Bible teacher, he was a preacher of the gospel. And when Brother Blue lived there, there were several denominational churches in the neighborhood. And they would have a meeting, or what they called a revival. Brother Blue knew everybody in the community, so he would go to their revival. And the denominational preacher would get up and preach faith only, or once saved, always saved, or some other denominational doctrine. And when he got through, Brother Blue would say, "Could I say a few words?" And I guess they were a little bit anxious about it, but they said, "Well, certainly." They all looked up to Brother Blue. And Brother Blue would get up and make a statement something like this. By the way, Charles Coyle, a preacher some of you may have heard of or may have known, was from this community where Brother Blue lived, and he's the one who told me this particular story. He said Brother Blue would get up after a denominational preacher delivered a sermon, and he would say, "Now, friends, you all know me, and you know I live here in this community. I farm here, and you know that I preach the gospel. And if what this man has said here tonight is true, what I've been preaching is false. And I want to be sure that I am teaching the truth. And here are the scriptures that I've been using." And he would just go into and virtually preach a sermon to them, answering every point that the denominational preacher had made. Well, after a while, the denominations quit having revivals. Well, they said, if we invite somebody in here to preach and to conduct a revival for us, Brother Blue will come and stand up and answer everything that he says. So they just quit having revivals altogether. And eventually, these denominational bodies ceased to meet. They did not even have their regular meetings anymore. And it was the result of the teaching of Brother Joe Blue. And he was not ugly. He was not mean-spirited. But he was very earnest in what he had to say. And he would answer every false teaching that was presented in his home community. And so what Brother Morgan says here is, for 35 years of Brother Blue's life, there was not a denominational or sectarian sermon preached in his community. Isn't that remarkable? That's the kind of man Joe Blue was. But I maybe haven't even got to the best part of his story that I want to tell you about. Brother Blue tells about going to a meeting at a church called Pleasant Valley. Now, when you hear what happened there, you may wonder why it was called Pleasant Valley. Brother Blue was preaching the gospel, and you know, those old-time preachers, they were pretty plain. They were pretty plain spoken. They didn't try to gloss over the truth. They just presented it. And they presented book, chapter, and verse in order to sustain whatever they were saying. And Brother Blue went to this church called Pleasant Valley, and they didn't have air conditioning, of course, so the windows were raised. And there were people that couldn't get in the building. People used to turn out for a gospel meeting. They wanted to hear what the preacher had to say. So they would stand at the windows and listen to the preaching. I've had a meeting or two like that myself, even in my time. Not many, but I can remember holding a meeting or two where that you could not get everybody in the building. And people would stand outside the front door with the door open, or they'd stand at the windows and listen to the preaching. And on this occasion, Brother Blue said they had green walnuts, and they would throw them at him while he was preaching. But now the worst thing that happened to him in that meeting was some of the ruffians, I would call them, in the community put dynamite under the pulpit. And they lit the fuse before Brother Blue got up to preach. Fortunately, the fuse went out before it reached the explosives, and it did not go off, but they intended for it to go off. The dynamite was there, the fuse was there, and they lit the fuse. And several years ago, I was at a meeting over in Arkansas. I want to say it was a town called Crossett, Arkansas. And the preacher said, would you like to go out and visit the building where they tried to dynamite Brother Joe Blue during a meeting he was holding? I said, yes, I've heard about that, but I didn't even know I was in the same area. He said, we'll drive out there. So we drove out to the Pleasant Valley building and went in, and he moved the pulpit over about 6 or 8 inches. And there under the pulpit was the burned, charred boards where they had lit the dynamite. You could still see where the fuse had burned. You could still see the burned, charred marks of what they had tried to do. Well, now, several years ago, that Pleasant Valley building got torn down. But there was a man that was raised there, and he could not bear to see that pulpit destroyed. So he lived in Tupelo, Mississippi. He drove over to the Pleasant Valley Church in Arkansas, and he took up the pulpit and the boards that were under the pulpit and brought them back with him. And these are now located in the building of the West Main Church of Christ in Tupelo, Mississippi. They have put it in one of their classrooms. And you can go back there, read the history of it. You can see the pulpit. You can look down under it and see that burned place in the floor where they tried to dynamite Brother Joe Blue when he got up to preach. So I'd like to suggest to you that if you're ever passing through Tupelo, and if you have enough time, go out and visit the West Main congregation and tell them, I would like to see the pulpit where Joe Blue preached when they tried to set dynamite. And they'll take you back there and show you. We still have it. It's still there. You can still see the marks where the dynamite was lit. So again, this is what happened in the preaching of the gospel of some of our old pioneer preachers. They endured a great deal. And then Brother Blue had a lot of humor about him. He had a lot of wit about him. And Boyd Morgan really looked up to Joe Blue. He really admired him. He knew him. And of course he writes about him in his book. But he says that he, that is Brother Morgan, was preaching for the church at Mammoth Spring, Arkansas. Well, I've been there. I've conducted a meeting at Mammoth Spring. I didn't know this history when I was there. I was a young man in my 20s, I think, when I went there and conducted a meeting. But I've been to the church in Mammoth Spring. And Brother Morgan was the preacher there. And he wanted to have a lectureship. It'd be similar to a gospel meeting, but instead of having one man speak for the week, they would have a different speaker each night. And so he went to the elders and asked them, could we have a lectureship, have like Monday through Friday night, have a different speaker come every night? And the elders said yes, on the condition that they'd be willing to come for $10 each. They would spend a total of $50, 5 nights, $10 a night, in order to have that lectureship. So Brother Morgan wrote to Joe Blue and said, we're going to have a lectureship. We want you to come. We want you to speak one night during our lectureship, but I want to tell you that we can only pay $10. And then Brother Morgan said, but we want a $100 sermon. So Brother Blue wrote him back, and Brother Morgan published Joe Blue's letter. And I have that letter in front of me now. Dear Brother Morgan, your letter came to me yesterday afternoon. Many thanks. I'm always glad to get a word from Boyd. The Lord willing, I shall be with you, brethren, April 24, 1953. I hope the lectureship will be good. I note what you wrote me about paying me $10 for a $100 sermon. That is too great a sacrifice for an old, worn-out preacher to make. I have different prices on sermons. I have one I can let you have for $12.35. And one for $15. And then I have one $25 sermon. I also have one for $7.89. I have another very nice one for $3.69. I'm closing out on one you can have for 17 cents plus tax. I just can almost see Brother Blue grinning while he was writing this letter. All in all, I think you need about a $2.40 sermon. But when you go into $100 sermons, it takes lots of rousement. And he would have to get all roused up in order to preach a sermon like that. We are very poorly, Mary, that was his wife, has been very poorly for the last 2 weeks. I fear I will not be able to make our little garden. I had a letter last Monday from Brother W.A. Hall of Bay, Arkansas. He is now at Hot Springs taking baths. He is in serious condition. I fear that he will not live long. Yours in the one way, Joe H. Blue. Don't you love somebody like that? I've thought in my years as a preacher, isn't it wonderful to have models of this kind? Someone you can look up to. And I guess over all the years, I have been an admirer of the older preachers. When I was 16 years old, I heard G.C. Brewer for the very first time. Brother Brewer's daughter invited me to travel with Brother Brewer from Searcy, Arkansas, where I was in high school, to Marlton, Arkansas, where Brother Brewer was going to preach one night. And I rode with him in his car from Searcy to Marlton and back that night. And I heard Brother Brewer speak for 1 hour and 20 minutes. 16 years old. And I sat on the front row. And I was mesmerized by hearing Brother Brewer. You'd think that most 16-year-olds might be bored by an hour and 20-minute sermon, but I want you to know I loved every word. And that audience hung on every word. Brewer was a great proclaimer of the gospel. He's a man that had a deep, resonant voice, and he had a wonderful knowledge. And I heard Brother Brewer preach that hour and 20 minutes and then rode back with him from Marlton, Arkansas, over to Searcy. He was an influence on me. And he died at the age of only 72. And I read about men like this. Brother Blue, Brother Oscar Hayes, walking 46 miles to get home from a meeting through 3 inches of snow after being paid $2 plus a handkerchief. That gives me something to think about. And what admiration I have for these older preachers. You know, a few years ago, one of my teachers at Freed Hardeman, when I was a student in college, called me. He knew I loved the older preachers. He said, "Would you like to meet Mrs. J.D. Tant?" Well, I'd heard of Brother Tant. I never knew him. He died long before. I didn't realize his wife was still living. She was a few years younger than he was. "Would you like to meet Mrs. J.D. Tant?" I said, "Absolutely." He said, "She's at my house." His wife was a granddaughter to J.D. Tant. And I went out to the house of this professor, and I met Mrs. J.D. Tant. And what a witty, remarkable lady she was. But just to be there in her presence and to talk to her, her husband being one of those that went through all of these hard times and sacrifices in order to preach the gospel of Christ. It's one of my favorite memories of all the experiences that I've ever had. And I love hearing her talk and thinking about her living with J.D. Tant and going through all of the many sacrifices that Brother Tant went through. I have a letter here. This is a copy of the original letter. It was written by E.C. Fuquay. Brother Fuquay was a preacher around Florence, Alabama, and then he moved out to Texas. He put out a little paper called The Vindicator. You may have seen copies of it in years past. He started it. It came out every month. The subscription price was 50 cents a year. You got 12 issues for 50 cents. Later, he had to raise the price to $1. And I think as long as Brother Fuquay lived, he sent out that paper for $1 a year. And it was one of the strongest papers on first principles that I ever read. But early in his life, Brother Fuquay was a missionary, you might say, down in the state of Mississippi. And Brother Walter Howell of Middleton, Tennessee, whom I knew, way back there, there's no date on this letter. I don't know just exactly when it was, but it was long ago. By the way, Bailey Howell, who played basketball for the Boston Celtics and for Mississippi State University, and is now an elder in the church in Starkville, Mississippi, is the son of this Brother Howell to whom this letter was written. But this is a letter that Brother Fuquay wrote after Walter Howell sent him a $5 contribution. Dear Brother Howell, your interesting letter and check for $5 just received, with sincere thanks for both. Especially my remembrance of Brother Gus Dunn and his visit to my cabin home. Brother Dunn and I were both preaching the gospel around Water Valley, Mississippi. And so far as I know, I was alone until Brother Gus knocked on my cabin door. A typical cabin had just one small room, one door, no windows, and a stick and dirt chimney that we could never warm by it. It would catch fire easily. My mother and my wife tried to live in such a cabin. We only had one bed, and Mother had to have that. Wife and I slept on the floor. Mother died a short time before Brother Dunn visited us. The cemetery was about 200 yards from my cabin door. I had no horse and no buggy. I preached at Hatton, Mississippi, 6 months, to the small church that attended. From my cabin, it was 11 miles to Hatton. I walked the distance, 22 miles there and back, never failing to show up for services. Sometimes it was raining. One time I remember I became so sleepy that I pulled high broom sage and made me a bed and never waked up until the sun was up. My wife was frantic when I did not get home, as I never failed before. So far as I now remember, I never received 1 penny for that 6 months of preaching. But a Brother Hughes came to see me and brought me a dozen eggs, and I was given just a few hours before Brother Dunn knocked on my door. Was that providential? Anyhow, that is how Gus got dinner that day. Brother Dunn stayed most of the night, and we counted our blessings and went to bed. The bacon left from supper was put away carefully. But that night while we were sleeping, a mountain lion came in and tried to carry our bacon to his lair. He got one piece, but could not get it through the half door The rest he left for us. A couple of neighborhood boys the next day went hunting for that line and treed it in a tall sweet gum. From head to tail, it measured 9 feet. In my walks for 6 months, I feared contact with other beasts, but was never actually attacked. In stickability, it cost a lot to hold a meeting under such circumstances. No money was exchanged, or there wasn't any. It was dire suffering most of the time. Before moving to this cabin, we rented another cabin at Parla, Mississippi. It may be accurate, a cowshed. Mother was then living, but in very poor health. She was given I'm having to read this carefully. She was, and I've read it several times before. At any rate, I can't read what he says right there, but he says, I was preaching every night some 5 or 6 miles from my cowshed home and walking as usual. This account of some of my struggles haunted me for 3 years. And I suspect that Brother Dunn had like success, if that word truly expresses the situation. I baptized many people, and I'm quite sure it was not without sacrifice that attended these baptisms. God knows. Brother Howell, I'm thankful that you are not suffering so much and that you will soon be well again. Your checks are deeply appreciated. And while I'm not preaching anymore, I all the more appreciate the spirit of your letter. I would like to hear from Brother Dunn. Yours in Christ Jesus, E.C. Fuquay. That letter just happened to be preserved. It's a wonder that we still have a copy of it. But Brother Howell sent him $5, and this was the letter that he wrote back about where he lived. Not in this letter, but in something else that I've read. Brother Fuquay was holding a meeting in a community in Mississippi, and he was holding the meeting in a schoolhouse. That was true of many meetings in years gone by. The school would have a room or an auditorium where they could meet, and they'd rent the building and conduct a meeting there. One night, Brother Fuquay, who had to walk, of course, from the cabin where he lived in order to get there to conduct the meeting, one night when he got there, there was a grave directly in front of the steps that led into the building. And there was a marker on the grave. And the marker said this: here lies E.C. Fuquay, who died preaching lies to the people of Burgess. The little town was Burgess, Mississippi. So Brother Fuquay came and had to step over his own grave, so to speak, in order to preach the gospel. So again, my heart swells with admiration when I read about these men and the sacrifices they made in order that we can enjoy the freedom that we do today and the growth in the church. You notice he says something in here about many were being baptized. And you could read these stories over and over. In fact, this book by Brother Boyd Morgan is full of stories like that. The sacrifices that these individuals made in order to preach the gospel. I remember reading the book about Brother J.D. Tant's life and about how that he preached for an entire year for a congregation and received about $400 for the year. That was his total income for preaching the gospel for a year in a certain congregation. So I want you to think back, as I think back, about these men that sacrificed so much in order for the truth to be presented. Most of them I did not know. There are some men that I knew that had made great sacrifices. Brother Brewer, I mentioned earlier, Brother N.B. Hardeman, Brother Foy Wallace. At one time, probably in the 1940s, they were the three best-known preachers in the church. And I had the privilege to know each of them in their older years and to hear them preach. In fact, I used to go by Brother Hardeman's house in Memphis when he was well up into his 80s and visit with him. And I have a book that he autographed for me during one of those visits. And he had been one of the greatest preachers in the brotherhood, preaching to thousands of people. And I just think about the lives they lived and the things that they did and all of the things that they accomplished, even though it was through great hardship and sacrifice. Sometimes if you want somebody to model your life after, and all of us need models, role models, think about some of these men that went before us and what they did and what they endured in order to preach the gospel. And let them be the role models for our lives. Not that we live in that kind of sacrifice, but that we respect what they did to assure that the gospel was preached. Well, that's all I have to say. You've been a wonderful audience. You've been so attentive. You've listened so respectfully. I appreciate it. And I look forward to being with you the remainder of the week.